Order. I now recognize, we'll start back in order. I think Mr. Swalwell completed our first session this morning. We'll now hear from the chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Mr. Jimenez from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to Secretary Mayorkas. Secretary Mayorkas, when President Biden first came into office, one of the first things he did is he changed all the Trump-era policies related to the southern border. Did you agree with those changes?
Congressman,
that's a yes or no answer, sir, please. I don't have much time. Did you agree with them or not?
Congressman, he changed some of the policies, and I do agree with those changes.
Okay, and subsequent to that, have you had a number of conversations with the president when you're making substantive changes or implementing new policies at the border? Have you relayed that to the president, and the president, has he said that he's in agreement with your recommendations, or has he made recommendations to you and said, or actually given you order and said, no, I want to do this? Do you agree with everything, that all the policies that have been implemented since you've been the Secretary of Homeland Security?
Congressman, I'm not going to get into the specifics of my conversations with the president, but please rest.
That's fair enough. I'm going to reclaim my time. Thank you very much. So apparently, I don't know if you talked to the president or not. Fair enough. So either you do things on your own or you do things in consultation with the president. You're still part of his administration. There's a lot been said about the funding of DHS. And so in fiscal year 2020, there were 458,000 encounters at the border. In fiscal year 2021, there was 1,734,686 encounters at the border. That's a 400% increase. There was no really significant change in the funding. So this whole narrative that somehow funding is the issue, funding's not the issue. The issue is policy. And the policies that have been implemented by this administration and your department in particular have led to this catastrophic failure of our immigration in the United States, where you have a 400% increase in the number of encounters at the border with the same amount of money, both in fiscal year 20 and 21. Now, in fiscal year 22, things got even worse. There are 2.378 million encounters at the border. And we also know there's been a significant increase in the number of gotaways to the point where almost 2 million people are in this country that we haven't the faintest idea who they are. We don't know where they came from. We don't know where they are, and we don't know why they're here. Again, Director Wray, does that pose a threat to the security of the United States? The fact that there's 2 million people here, we don't know who they are, why they're here, what they're doing here. Have you got any worries about that?
Well, certainly the population that you're talking about is a source of concern for us.
All right, one other question for you, Director Wray. You say that the FBI, you work on detecting threats, et cetera, to the United States and the Homeland. Exactly why are you doing that? What is the purpose of detecting threats and mitigating threats to the Homeland?
Well, our mission is to protect the American people and uphold the country.
Very good. Protecting the American people. That's exactly right. Do you know how many people, the #1 terrorist organization that has killed the most people in the United States, you know what that is?
That would be Al-Qaeda.
And how many people have they killed? Americans?
Well, in the neighborhood of 3,000.
3,000. Okay. Across the border, there's the Mexican cartels. They are pumping fentanyl into the United States. You know how many people they've killed?
I don't have that number, but it's eye-popping.
It is eye-popping. And so, again, the failure at the border, the failure of us taking significant action, not only to stop the flow of illegal immigrants, and a lot of them, we don't even know who they are, that it poses a threat to the United States. The actual threat of the cartels that are not 7,000 miles away, they're 20 miles away, they're 5 miles away on the other side of the border, that are killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, and we do nothing about it. Nothing. They're right there. We know who they are. We know where they're operating, and we do nothing about it. That is a dereliction of duty, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I got one more. If you give me one more thing, you know, real quick, okay? Guns, planes, missiles, personnel, ships, boats, assassins. They all have one thing in common. Ms. Abizaid, do you know what that is? It's money. Money. That's what they have in common. So I'd like to know why the Secretary Blinken signed off a waiver for Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran, which will give them $10 billion in revenue. And that's a rhetorical question. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Thanadar from Michigan, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank Ranking Member Thompson, both of you, for having this hearing today. I also want to express profound thanks to the most honorable witnesses for your valuable efforts that give the people of this great country the safety they need to have prosperous lives. As we discuss threats to the homeland here today, it looks like we will more likely avert a shutdown this time. But for the second time this year, the dysfunctional Republican majority has brought our government to the brink of a shutdown after weeks of infighting. Funding our government 45 days at a time has consequences. At the Transportation Security Administration, thanks to funding Democrats provided in the last year's omnibus spending bill, workers are finally receiving the pay they have long deserved. However, pay increases were only funded for the final quarter of fiscal year 2023. So continuing at fiscal 23 levels, instead of passing a full year spending bill, will have increasingly dire consequences for the agency. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for working with Congress to provide pay raises for TSA workers. What benefits is TSA seeing so far from pay raises, and what consequences would you expect to see if Congress does not provide funding to increase TSA's budget for fiscal 24?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for your concern for the men and women of TSA. I want to thank Ranking Member Thompson for championing fair pay for that workforce for many, many years, and I'm grateful to Congress for achieving fair pay finally. It has made a significant difference in the recruitment and retention of personnel who are vital to the security of the traveling public. If we lose that funding, we will return to recruiting and retention challenges precisely when travel is booming once again in a post-COVID-19 world.
Thank you, Secretary. And I, as a former business owner, I understand the importance of making sure the employees get paid fairly and they have the benefits that they need, because we are competing for these employees with the private sector, and they can always walk. And we have seen a high level of turnover in the past, and that would continue, and that will endanger our safety. But more broadly, for all witnesses, how does continually funding the government by short-term continuing resolution affect your agency's ability to execute your missions? I mean, I ran businesses and I never planned for 45-day budget. Usually it's a year, 2-year long, some also have a 5-year plan. That's how most businesses operate. How does this short-term funding affects and how you run your agencies, and how does that affect our national security?
Congressman, very difficult to plan. in the implementation of important security-related and security-focused initiatives when one does not know with certainty whether the funding for those initiatives will actually come through. I should also add a different element of this. It creates tremendous worry and instability within the workforce. In fact, for example, our Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office, I had an all-employee town hall with them because they were uncertain about their future employment. That is not a situation that we can afford at a time when we need to advance the security of the American people.
Thank you.
I would add to Secretary Mayorkas' comments that the funding approach that you're describing is incredibly disruptive to our operations. As you say, planning is an essential part of any well-functioning organization, and it's very, very hard to do that. And I would second the concerns about our workforce. As you know, more and more you have federal employees who are two federal employee couples, for example, and in a lot of places they're living paycheck to paycheck. So even with the law that was passed that ensures they will eventually get paid, which is a welcome development,
Yes.
In the short run, that's incredibly stressful for people who are battling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their families' heads.
Thank you.
And I would only add, I completely associate myself with my colleagues' comments. I would only add that, you know, what we've described is a pretty unpredictable global environment right now. And in the national security world, we need sort of a steady baseline from which we can operate and respond to crises. And so the added stress on the workforce of just being able to understand when and where their paycheck is coming from, I think is one that we don't want to really put on their shoulders.
Thank you so much. I'm over my time, so I yield back, Chair.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from Texas and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Director Abizaid, thank you for your service. I'm not going to have questions for you today. Mr. Chairman, we started this hearing by listening to Secretary Mayorkas talk about climate change as a threat to our country and obscure policies that need reauthorization, but not yet one mention of the southwest border and the 169 plus known or suspected terrorists that have entered this country. So I think it just shows you where the mindset is, and the American people know that. Director Wray, you said in front of the Senate committee last week, and you said again today, the reality is that terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole other level. Do you stand by that statement?
Absolutely.
If somebody is listed as a special interest alien or a KST, by the way, this is Trump-era KSTs, and this is Mayorkas-Biden-era KSTs. If somebody's listed as a KST, is that a concerning person, somebody who could do harm to the United States?
Well, to be on the watch list as a KST means that they've met the standard to be of concern.
So they're concerning to the FBI. You're looking for these people.
Yes.
Are there people that are listed in these numbers? I think the number was 169. They may have amended that from CBP DHS, but are there people that you are still searching for that we don't know where they are in the United States? Of the known apprehensions, KSTs, known or suspected terror people, match list to the terror watch list.
Well,
are you still searching for people in the United States that we know match the terror watch list?
I'm not sure I can answer that here because it's a constantly moving
Director
target.
Wray,
yes.
Are there people that match the terror watch list that were apprehended by CBP that the FBI and other agencies are searching for in the United States?
There are certainly individuals who are the subject of terrorism investigations that we are searching for.
Are there
Whether or not they're people, to me, I guess the distinction I'm drawing is, well, there's obviously a lot of focus on the watch list itself. One of the things that, and I've tried to be clear in my testimony here this morning, one of the areas that we are of concern is individuals who, once here, information later comes in.
Are there people that you don't? Are there people you
have,
don't know where they are that the FBI is searching for today?
Yes.
Yes or no? Yes. Secretary Mayorkas, is there a policy at DHS that requires CBP or any other agency involved with the vetting of individuals who match the terror watch list that requires these individuals to be detained? Does DHS have a policy of detainment for anybody who matches the terror watch list?
Congressman, on September 30th of 2021, I promulgated a policy that articulated quite clearly and quite expressly that individuals who pose a threat to the public safety.
Is there a policy at DHS and CBP that requires detainment of people who match the terror watch list? It's very simple.
That individuals who pose a threat to public safety or national security are a priority for enforcement, and if in fact
is every person that you have listed on the terror watch list detained right now?
And if in fact they pose such a threat, they are to be detained.
Okay, so why did you release people in the United States that match the terror watch list?
Congressman, we do not release individuals.
So you have detained every single person who matched the terror watch list that you apprehended at the southern border? 100%.
If you would allow me to answer the question.
Please answer it quickly. I don't need a filibuster.
If we believe that the detention of an individual is necessary to safeguard the safety of the American people, we continue to detain.
Secretary, I'm going to reclaim my time. If you and any other agency labels somebody as a match to the terror watch list, do you immediately detain them?
Congressman, if you are referring to the terrorist screening data set, the TSDS, we make a determination in the execution of our law enforcement responsibilities to detain an individual if that detention is
I believe that based on your testimony, based on Director Wray's, that there are people that you're still searching for that you should have detained, and I want to find out more information on it. Furthermore, in 2023, your agency, Secretary Mayorkas, reported that there were over 24,000 Chinese nationals who have entered the United States illegally. That's a 1,000% increase from 2022. Are there people that you are searching for, Director Wray, Secretary Mayorkas, that have entered this country? And is there intelligence to suggest that the CCP is trying to use or directing the flow of CCP or Chinese nationals into the United States?
Well, certainly there are individuals who are affiliated with the Chinese government who are the subject of investigations that we have here, and some of those are people that we're searching for. Now, how they came in, whether they came in illegally or not, is a different question. I'm not sure I can speak to that here in the aggregate, but what I can tell you is that I've been very consistent in saying that there is no country that presents a broader, more comprehensive threat to our economic security, our national security, our innovation than the Chinese government. And they use non-traditional collectors, not just traditional intelligence operatives, to cause that threat.
Secretary Mayorkas, based on Director Wray's testimony, that he believes that this threat is at a whole other level and you are not detaining people immediately, I am very concerned about the security of this nation and the fact that you have been derelict in your duty in securing our
Gentleman's
nation.
time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Carter. Or you went already, okay. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner, the ranking member for counterterrorism, the gentleman from Rhode Island, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your leadership and to the men and women who work under you, who keep our nation safe every day. You have our gratitude. And to Ranking Member Thompson and Chairman Green as well for calling this hearing. The Director of National Intelligence has assessed that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists present the greatest terror threats to our country. And I believe in your opening statements, our witnesses verified that assessment today. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists present the greatest terror threats to our country. Yet, as I've been listening, not one member from the other side of the aisle has focused any of their remarks or questions on what the DNI and our witnesses have identified as the greatest terror threat to our country. So I'm going to spend my time today talking about this and asking you about it, because we know that over the last 5 years, more Americans have been killed on our soil by racially motivated extremists than any other type of terror. We saw it in El Paso, Texas, where a racially motivated extremist killed 23 people in an attack explicitly targeting Latino and immigrant communities. In Buffalo, New York, where a racially motivated extremist targeted the black community, killing 10 people. Allen, Texas, where an extremist espousing anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi ideology shot up a mall, killing 8 people. Over the past decade, 145 Americans killed on U.S. soil in domestic extremist attacks, primarily racially and ethnically motivated. The FBI currently has 2,700 open domestic terrorism cases, and anti-government extremism poses a growing threat as well. We just learned the horrifying news that an associate of a January 6th defendant pleaded guilty to conspiring and plotting to murder 37 FBI employees in Chattanooga for the admitted purpose to retaliate against government conduct. And of course, in the wake of the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, we are seeing a significant rise in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic violence across the country. The Anti-Defamation League reports that anti-Semitic incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault have increased by 388% over the same period last year. Just this week, a Michigan man pleaded guilty to threatening to commit a mass shooting against the Jewish community. The Council on American Islamic Relations has similarly reported a 216% increase. And of course, we are all familiar with the tragic death of a 6-year-old Palestinian American who was horrifically killed in a hate crime a few weeks ago. So, given that this has been identified as the greatest terror threat facing our country, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity, starting with Director Wray, to talk about specifically racially and ethnically motivated extremism. What is the nature of this threat, and what does the FBI need from Congress in order to meet it?
So first, a point of clarification. And when we talk about the greatest threat to the homeland, the greatest threat to the homeland is lone actors or small groups, typically radicalized online, using easily accessible weapons to attack soft targets. And that group of lone actors includes both, as you rightly say, domestic violent extremists, as well as, though, that's the clarification, homegrown violent extremists who are individuals here who are inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. So that's what we call it at the highest threat level. Second, when it comes specifically on the domestic violent extremism side, domestic terrorism side, it is the case that over the last several years, the most lethal activity has been conducted here in the homeland by racially motivated violent extremists in terms of the most lethality. And then there's a second category, which you also noted in your question, which is anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, which is distinct, sometimes overlaps a little bit, but it's distinct from the racially motivated.
Is that, for example, what we saw on January 6th, the anti-government or inspired by?
That would be one variation on it, yeah. But so would the violence that we saw in the summer of 2020. Anarchist violent extremism is all in the category of anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism, and we've seen a lot of both. And so the volume in that category is probably the greatest. The lethality is probably the greatest on the racially motivated violent extremist side.
Secretary.
Congressman, let me share with you some of the work we are doing to combat this threat. We're working very closely with our federal partners, notably the FBI. We're working with state, local, tribal, territorial, and campus law enforcement, our frontline personnel. We are engaging with communities in developing best practices for prevention models to be able to intervene when individuals are seeing somebody descend down a path of radicalization to violence. We are, thanks to the support of Congress, distributing grant funds to nonprofit organizations. In fact, we've sought a $200 million increase in that critically needed grant program, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, to enable nonprofit organizations, including places of worship, religious schools, to secure themselves. We have protective security advisors in every state providing advice as to how facilities, places of gathering can best secure themselves. Those are some of the steps that we are taking to combat this threat in an environment of critically needed partnership.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, just to answer the question. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism over the last 5 years, as you noted, has created the most lethality for Americans, especially here in the Homeland, but it is a global threat. At the National Counterterrorism Center, we're focused on issues that have a foreign nexus, and we would say that racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism certainly has a foreign nexus. When you look at the motivation behind a shooter in New York who goes to a supermarket and kills Black Americans, that is motivated by manifestos that we see from New Zealand and from Norway, and actually inspired later attacks that we saw in Slovakia. And so understanding the global dynamics around this type of terrorism, I think, is a really important piece of what we're doing to try and keep up with an evolving threat dynamic that is affecting many countries.
Well, thank you for your work in this area. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Garbarino, the gentleman from New York and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Cyber, for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses being here. A couple weeks ago, we had some witnesses come in and testify about Iranian threats, and I want to ask Director Wray, you said recently that you expect Iranian cyber threats to worsen if the conflict in Israel expands. Can you expand on that? What should we specifically be watching out for?
Well, I think sometimes people overlook the fact that Iran is one of only 2 countries to have committed a destructive cyber attack against the United States. And it's been a few years since that happened. So they've already shown a propensity for that. And we saw not that long ago an attempted cyber attack from Iran against a children's hospital in New England. So this is an adversary that is engaged in conduct that is brazen and aggressive, and it is very comparable, in my view, to what we see in terms of the lethal targeting that I described in my opening statement and to this committee last year, which is a country which has attempted to assassinate an American journalist and human rights activist right smack in the middle of New York City, and tried to assassinate current and former U.S. officials here on U.S. soil. And so the cyber threat that they pose in some ways shows a similar level of aggressiveness and brazenness.
So again, specific targets, not industries as a whole. Do you think they're like, I know other countries are focused specifically on possibly industries taking down an entire sector. Would you expect the Iranians to focus on, like you said, the hospitals specific targets?
I think critical infrastructure is obviously where we're most concerned. I'm not sure that I could tell you sitting here right now which of the 16 sectors, but critical infrastructure is where we would be most concerned about their potential cyber activity.
Thank you. Secretary Mayorkas, what's DHS doing to prepare for these possible cyber attacks coming up? And because I know when Russia invaded Ukraine, we did the Shields Up program. So have you done anything since there's been the war in Israel? What's DHS doing?
Congressman, so day to day, we work with our private sector partners. We have the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that our CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, operates. We are working with our partners in Israel. We are sharing information and best practices with them. We work very closely with them because they are, in fact, experiencing an increase in cyber attacks. It's taking a page out of the playbook that you mentioned, our incredible work with Ukraine in the Shields Up campaign. So we have many different lines of effort that we are employing on a day-to-day basis to protect critical infrastructure.
Thank you. And I think one of those things is focusing on workforce. So, Director Wray, you said earlier this year that even if all of the FBI's cyber agents and intel analysts focus exclusively on China threats, Chinese hackers would still outnumber the FBI cyber personnel by 50 to 1. Is that still the case? What's FBI doing to deal with that?
Well, that is still my assessment of the numerical disadvantage that we are at. China has a bigger hacking program than that of every other major nation combined, and has stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than that of every nation, big or small, combined. So it is a scale that is significant. In terms of what we're doing, in addition to trying to focus on recruiting cyber talent, both among agents but also computer scientists, data analysts, data scientists, We are also focusing very heavily, and some of this is in the budget request that's up before Congress, focus on advanced training for our existing workforce. Because one of the things that I hear consistently from our agents who work this area is that while people who know the ones and zeros is incredibly important, if you've got a really good agent who's got the good agent skills, you can, if you get the right training, you can teach them a lot of the cyber stuff that they need. And so we're trying to raise the median cyber proficiency in the workforce, not just recruit our way out of the problem.
I appreciate that. And we did meet with some of your agents on a bipartisan trip overseas, some of the work they're doing, and they're doing a really good job overseas, I think, especially with the share information. I wanted to focus, though, lastly, on anti-Semitism, that we're seeing the rise in anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses. There are college campuses around that have student groups that don't seem to be getting, that are promoting anti-Semitism, but don't seem to be getting funding from the universities. There's one here in DC at a school here. Where they have you been focused on where they're getting their funding from? Is it coming from outside sources? Is it coming from overseas, specifically for these student groups that have caused a lot of rise in anti-Semitism on campuses?
Well, when we investigate funding issues, it's in the context of something where we have a properly predicated investigation. So we're not investigating funding in support of First Amendment activity, just to be clear. But certainly we are looking at funding, and have for quite some time, looking at funding of Hamas, going in the other direction, and funding, including looking at Hamas's use of cryptocurrency and things like that. When it comes to groups here, if they are engaged in activity that is properly predicated as a criminal or national security investigation, then funding is, of course, part of what we would be looking at.
I think, and I know I'm out of time, but I think the focus on how these student groups are so well, they're well prepared, they are well governed. I mean, the money's got to be coming from somewhere. If it's not coming from the universities, I think it's coming from somewhere, but I'm out of time.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize a gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, who is the ranking member on oversight.
That's
for
correct.
5 minutes.
Mr. Bishop's subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on a couple of questions. One was to the director. At the end of Congressman Higgins' testimony or questioning, he had a photo with two buses on it, and I wasn't able to. We tried to figure out what he was getting at, but it sounded like he was suggesting that there were FBI operatives who were and infiltrated the January, like two busloads of FBI operatives who had infiltrated the January 6th raid, and I wanted to give you a chance to clarify on that.
Well, I can't speak to the photo. I mean, I haven't seen the photo before, so I can't speak to the specifics of his photo and what it does or doesn't show. But what I can say, and what I tried to say in response to his questions, is that if somebody is asking or suggesting whether the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources or FBI agents or both, the answer is emphatically not. And to suggest to the contrary, I think, is a disservice to the hardworking men and women of the FBI who bust their tails every day to keep Americans, including everybody up on Capitol Hill, safe.
Yeah, I want to add as well, I used to be an AUSA in this office here in Washington, and actually was handling cases against them while the prosecutions were taking place. I do want to commend your office and the Department of Justice prosecutors for putting together, I guess, like 700 cases, I think, at this point, the vast majority of which have been successful, so I commend you for that. I did want to ask about FISA as well. I'm on Judiciary. You testified about FISA 702. As you know, the time's coming up for reauthorization on that. There are questions about whether the reauthorization should contain some statutory changes that put additional restrictions on your office. I know you've had some objections to that and said that your office has made some internal changes. I wanted to get a sense of hearing what those are, though, before I made a final decision on what I want to do with respect to that bill. There's two, actually.
Well, I will say two things. First, on the impact of the changes, and then what the changes were themselves. the most important thing for this committee and for Congress to take away on the changes we've made is the results of those changes, which have now been found. You don't have to just take my word for it. Look at the FISA court itself. The same FISA judge, by the way, who rightly criticized us earlier, found that our reforms that we've put in place have resulted in...
Yes, but if you could tell us what they are, I'd appreciate it.
So the changes include all sorts of changes to training, oversight, internal oversight, pre-approvals, new accountability.
Let me stop you on that
policies.
one. Pre-approvals. What are the pre-approval requirements that have been put in place now?
Well, there are a whole slew of them. Some have to do with when you have what's called a batch query, when there's a large number of query terms. That's one as an example. Certain kinds of sensitive query terms have to get run all the way up to the level of deputy director. I'd be happy to arrange a more detailed briefing because it is quite detailed.
That'd be
Among
great.
the other changes we've put in place is I created an entire new Office of Internal Audit at the FBI that did not exist before.
Well, let's do this. If you could supplement your testimony with the written, you may have done it someplace else, but if you could send me whatever it is that lays out the details of the changes you've made, I'd appreciate it. And Ms. Abizaid, I hope, okay, I got close. You mentioned 702 in your testimony, but you didn't have anything in your written testimony about it. I was wondering if you could answer the same kind of question. What sorts of changes, or you might think the current law is fine, but if you think the reforms that have been made are sufficient, or what's your position on that?
So I know the Department of Justice is engaged in a robust conversation about what kinds of reforms should be considered. I would only reinforce what I said in my oral testimony, which is that 702 is a vital authority for the CT community, and agility is key to that authority. So anything we do that reauthorizes it and preserves that agility will be incredibly important.
Okay, well, fair enough. If you've got additional proposed reforms you'd like to suggest, please send those in writing too. I've run out of time with respect to a couple of things here, but I did want to end with this. Mr. McCall, and I'm sorry he's not here, but he had a chance to respond to Mr. Goldman, but the aiding and abetting allegation that was directed at you, Secretary Mayorkas, I thought was just inappropriate and incorrect. I just wanted to register that on the record. I know there have been some disagreements about the way you've run the office and that sort of thing, but I just don't see how that's productive. So with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for his 5 minutes question.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I represent the largest border district in Congress. This border crisis is very real to us, not only for all Americans, but we're at the forefront of it. I want to start with Secretary Mayorkas. In April, you told 60 Minutes the migrant surge across our border are resulting from disinformation by cartels. I would go a step further and say that these cartels are terrorizing America, and it is long time that we label these cartels as terrorist organizations. I have a few questions for you, if you could be either yes or no or brief in your response. My first question is this, and I'm looking for solutions. Would raising the credible fear standards improve our border?
Congressman, the asylum system and the immigration system as a whole is in desperate need of reform, and I look forward to working with Congress on achieving that reform.
Do you think
it's long overdue?
Do you think that would help?
I think, Congressman, it is very difficult to take one element of an expansive system and say that is...
Well, let's talk about a couple of other elements. I think it would work. Everyone I talk to is saying raise the credible fear standards is a good start. I hope you would consider also being vocal on that. The second part, would increasing repatriation flights improve our border?
Congressman, we work with our international partners every day to increase the number of repatriation flights. In fact, our supplemental funding request seeks additional funds to achieve that.
Do these repatriation flights work?
Yes,
I would agree with that. I've seen it firsthand. As soon as we turn on repatriation flights, the numbers go down. My third question, would increasing penalties to smugglers improve our border?
Congressman, I would like to analyze whether or not the severity of the penalties available are sufficient. I can tell you from my experience in the courthouse, in the courtroom as a federal prosecutor, that the delivery of consequences achieves an important law enforcement objective.
What I'm seeing is the consequences don't match the crime, and the crime, Americans are dying, and it's long time for us to match the crime to what is occurring. My last question for you, Mr. Secretary, do you agree we have a crisis at the southern border? Yes or no?
Congressman, I've been asked this question many times. Let me just assure you that we do not minimize the significance of the challenge at the border.
I'd like to now ask Director Wray. I agree with your stance on China. Firmly believe China is a grave threat to our nation on all different fronts, and I appreciate your stance on that. My question is, how substantial are the Chinese state ties to entities sending fentanyl ingredients to the Mexican cartels?
Well, I'm not sure what I can share in this setting on that, but let me try it this way. When it comes to questions about state ties and China, I think it's important for Americans to understand the distinctions that we draw in this country between the government and, say, the private sector are distinctions that in the Chinese country, in the Chinese government, the Chinese state, are distinctions that are blurry at best, if non-existent. And so we have certainly seen that entities in China, unscrupulous actors in China, are the primary source not just of fentanyl precursors, but of pill presses, which are used to press the fentanyl, and by the way, of precursors for meth in the labs in Mexico as well. So whether or not that traces back to the CCP directly, that I can't speak to here.
Going back to my 20 years in the military, the Chinese Communist Party is interacted in every aspect of their government. Very briefly, if you could respond, do you think Chairman Xi can turn it on or off? Is he critical to turning these precursors or anything on or off?
There is not a doubt in my mind that if the Chinese government wanted to be more aggressive and serious about clamping down on precursors for fentanyl and meth and pill presses, there are all sorts of things they could do, and we would welcome their contribution to that.
I agree with you. I want to move on to the terrorist attack that happened in Israel. Following Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States. Would you agree?
Yes.
If someone here is in the United States on a visa and they actively support terrorism, what happens to them?
Well, I'm not an expert on visa revocation, but if they meet the appropriate visa revocation standard, then action is taken administratively to revoke their visa.
Right now, it's illegal. If you are here on a visa and you actively are supporting a terrorist organization, it's illegal, and you need to be deported. The question I have is, how many cases has the FBI pursued in this route?
Well, visa revocation is not within our authorities. Sure. We obviously work with our partners and share information when we have evidence about somebody's
have there been cases
terrorism. I don't have a number for you today, but certainly visa revocation is an important tool that the whole of government
has any occurred this year?
Have any visa revocations occurred?
Where you've worked with other partners, I'll close out here, Chairman, that you've worked with other entities in the government to determine if these visa stays are indeed supporting terrorism?
I mean, I know that we've had all sorts of cases that have resulted in visa revocation, whether or not they fit the exact criteria.
But there are active cases that you've been working on.
We view visa revocation as an important tool in the toolbox. The only thing I'm clarifying is that it's not our tool, but
Sure.
It's a tool we contribute to by sharing.
You do contribute. Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses here today and for your service. I want to start, Mr. Secretary. I know that this last Tuesday night, one of our colleagues also sits on this committee, really decided to waste our time with a very political stunt, which made some deeply unfair and untrue allegations against you, sir. And while I'm glad that 8 Republicans joined us in defeating that resolution, I'd like to take a moment to correct the record for the public and the American people. So, Mr. Secretary, yes or no, is our country currently being invaded?
Congressman, that is a term that I find to be offensive.
And I do as well, thank you. And is invasion, excuse me, this is my time screen. Is invasion a responsible way to characterize people who come to the U.S. to seek asylum?
Congressman, I've been asked very often in many hearings now. I heard one congressman actually cite that I've participated in 27 hearings. I didn't realize the number was that large. I am not focused on language. I'm focused on the challenges that we face and making sure that we meet those challenges on behalf of the American people.
Thank you, sir. And is your agency working every day to stop fentanyl from coming into our country?
It most certainly is.
Thank you. And is it true that the overwhelming majority of fentanyl is in fact carried through ports of entry by American citizens into this country?
It is, Congressman.
Is it fair to say that an orderly border actually requires comprehensive immigration reform, which would require congressional action rather than just executive actions?
Congressman, immigration reform is vitally necessary to advancing the security of our border.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you. Those are simple questions, but I think that your record keeps being distorted unfairly, and so I want to make sure give you a chance to clear that up. And I think it's also important to hear how we're talking about security and our threats to the homeland, how the current head of the Republican Party spent Veterans Day just recently. So I want to read you this first sentence. In honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, lie, steal, and cheat on elections, and will do anything possible, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and the American dream. Here we see Donald Trump calling his fellow Americans vermin and threatening to root out people based on their political beliefs. This is the kind of rhetoric that reminds me of the worst types of dictators in history, and it's not Trump's first time using this kind of rhetoric. He told an audience in Iowa that immigrants were poisoning the blood of our country. That's a quote. He has promised to violate federal laws in order to build mass deportation camps and promised to restore his Muslim ban. He even wants to cancel legal status for certain categories of immigrants. Donald Trump, of course, has had dinner and hosted open Holocaust deniers and white nationalists. And we all, of course, remember that he praised the white nationalist Charlottesville marchers who chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And of course, he faces federal felony charges for his role in the January 6th insurrection. Now, Mr. Secretary, Director Wray, I'm not going to ask you to respond directly to Donald Trump's statements, but I think we can all agree that they're not worthy of certainly anybody running for president. And as we move into this election year, I'm deeply concerned about Donald Trump, particularly as he faces more and more pressure from his supporters that may try to invoke as additional violence that we might see from fringe supporters of his. Now, Mr. Secretary, I wrote to you ahead of Donald Trump's first indictment expressing concerns about his ability to provoke violent attacks, and I'd like to thank you for your ongoing attention to this matter and more broadly for taking on the challenges we have around white supremacy, around the huge actions that are happening across this country that impact a lot of people. We also know that Donald Trump isn't the only politician that has used a history of, or has a history of violent rhetoric in this country, and we need to call it out at every single turn. I want to just finally, Mr. Director Wray, I want to raise one final issue with you. The Anti-Defamation League found that in 2022, mass shootings in the U.S. accounted for most extremism-related fatalities last year, with about 80% of those murders committed by white supremacists. We saw that in the Dallas area mall case, in the Dollar General store in Jacksonville. There's been additional shootings after shootings. What would you need from Congress to help you better tackle this threat as it relates to mass shootings?
Well, our budget request that went up in the fiscal 24 budget request includes a number of resources for counterterrorism, including that would speak to this threat. That's important because, as you've heard in my testimony here today, the foreign terrorist threat is not only not abating, but it's intensifying. And so we certainly can't be put in a position where we're having to, rob Peter to pay Paul, if you will, to protect the American people from all forms of terrorist attack.
Thank you.
There also, I should say, on the issue of mass acts of violence, mass shootings, putting ideology aside or anything, or motivation, I think there are also parts of the appropriation request that go to our ability at NICS to do background checks in a timely way and process, obviously, make sure that guns are not purchased by people who are prohibited under existing law from having them.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Secretary Mayorkas, I want you to look at these innocent Americans. Do you see them?
I do, Congresswoman.
They are dead. They're from Dalton, Georgia, in my district. They're dead because a 17-year-old, likely affiliated with the cartels, was smuggling illegal aliens into our country in Texas, breaking our laws, and this happens every single day in our country. Earlier this week, 8 Republicans joined the Democrats and protected your job. But I want you to know, you have a short time coming. You can honorably resign, or we are going to impeach you, and it's happening very, very soon. Mr. Wray, do you remember on October 18th when the Capitol complex was illegally occupied, breaking same laws that you have hunted down Americans for from January 6th? Are you familiar with this?
I don't recognize the picture that you're holding.
Well, because maybe your agents haven't been doing a good job into investigating the organizers that broke the law, illegally occupied this very building that we're sitting in right now, and over 300 of them were arrested. Some of them attacked police officers. I haven't seen on the news where the FBI is hunting them down with helicopters, tanks in the streets, raiding their homes with flashbangs, targeting these people, watching these people, throwing them in jail for them to stay in pre-trial in solitary confinement for years before they ever face trial. You want to know what this says? I'll tell you. This is one of the organizers' phones, and this is a chat, and it says at the top, Global Intifada. Now, while we're talking about terrorism today, are you familiar with the term Intifada?
I've certainly heard the term.
Do you know the definition?
I'm not going to try to define it, but
It means Arab uprising or jihad. Are you concerned about jihad in this country?
I am, and I have consistently testified to that effect.
Yes, but are you interested in using the FBI? You are the director of the FBI. Do you hunt down terrorists in our country? Those that would be responsible for jihad?
Absolutely, and that's why we've had jihadist-inspired terrorism at our highest national threat priority level since the day that I started as FBI director.
Do you still use the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source? You use them. The FBI used the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source when targeting Catholics. Are you still using the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source?
Congresswoman, what I think you're referring to is the so-called Richmond intelligence product, which as soon as I learned about it, I was horrified, withdrew it. We had an inspection done, and part of the problem that we found with that particular product by that particular office is precisely what you're talking about, the reliance on the Southern Poverty Law Center and the way in which they relied on it.
Well, you relied on the Southern Poverty Law Center, but I would have you know, Mr. Wray, that this one right here, this person involved in the Global Intifada group that illegally, they broke the law, came in and occupied the Cannon Office House building, interrupted Congress, interrupted hearings. Right here, Katrina Bleakley is the lead attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Were you aware of this?
Congresswoman, as I said, I haven't seen the photos that you're holding up before.
Maybe, well, I posted them on my Twitter account. It's public. You know, maybe
I don't
you guys
spend a lot of time on Twitter.
Well, you know, oh, I'm sure you do, because the Department of Homeland Security, organized with other offices, has censored many Americans, including myself.
I'm not part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Right, Mr. Wray, you should be interested in investigating terrorism, and this right here is proof that we had terrorists in our own office building. Global Intifada. And you rely on the Southern Poverty Law Centers. Katrina Bleakley is one of the organizers. I'll send this over to your office so maybe perhaps you can stop targeting innocent grandmothers and veterans who walked through the Capitol on January 6th and might actually go after people tied to Hamas, tied to Hezbollah, and likely Iran. Mr. Wray, are you interested in members of Congress that are organized and participating in a Facebook group that has ties to Hamas?
We're not investigating people for participating in a Facebook group.
A Facebook group that is tied to Hamas?
We have multiple investigations into individuals affiliated with Hamas, and they're active investigations.
You're going to tell me as FBI director you will not investigate Americans or United States members of Congress that are linked to known terrorists?
That's not what I said.
Are you going to investigate or not?
We are going to investigate individuals who are affiliated with Hamas if they meet our standards for predication, which are longstanding standards set by this department and the prior department and the department before that.
I would hope to God that intifada and jihad and terrorists in our very country would be something that you would prioritize instead of a 3-hour event that happened at the Capitol nearly 4 years ago, Mr. Wray. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez. I think you're up next, sir.
Thank you,
Gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, earlier in your testimony, did you say that defunding the FBI would be, quote, a gift to the Chinese Communist Party, quote, more power to the cartels, and, quote, more damage to critical infrastructure?
I believe I said words to that effect, yes.
I appreciate that. Not everybody was in the room during that part of your testimony. I want to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Higgins, said about, quote, armed oppression as one of the primary threats to the homeland. I agree that armed oppression is a massive threat to our homeland, but we need to be clear about what actually constitutes armed oppression. In this country, minority groups are routinely targets of weaponized oppression. Armed oppression is when black men cannot go safely for a run in Georgia. Armed oppression is when black youth cannot wear hoodies in Florida. Armed oppression is being LGBTQ in this country and not being able to safely go to a nightclub in Florida. Armed oppression is living in a Hispanic community and being targeted while going to Walmart in El Paso. Armed oppression is being black in this country and not being able to go grocery shopping in Buffalo without being targeted because of the color of your skin. Armed oppression is not being able to go safely to a church, synagogue, mosque, temple, or any place of worship to practice your faith. Domestic terrorists have targeted each of these locations and each of these groups in acts of armed oppression. Yet, when we in the House Committee on Homeland Security established our committee oversight plan for the 118th Congress, my Republican colleagues refused to include capital D, domestic terrorism in our plan. That, in my opinion, is where this committee is failing when we consider our threats to the homeland. New Jersey's 8th Congressional District is home to what Homeland Security experts call the most dangerous 2 miles in America, containing ports, airports, major rail lines, densely populated cities, and chemical plants. I'm proud of the work that President Biden and the New Jersey Congressional Delegation have done to improve the safety, reliability, and resiliency of critical infrastructure in North Jersey. The Biden administration has aggressively protected our critical infrastructure from foreign adversaries, with President Biden admonishing Russian President Vladimir Putin that certain critical infrastructure is off limits, a stark contrast to President Trump, who proposed a joint cyber unit with Russia. Secretary Mayorkas, when considering the threat landscape, how does the department take into account the risk posed by having multiple critical infrastructure sectors in close geographic proximity?
Congressman, the proximity of elements of our critical infrastructure only increase the challenge that we confront, but we work very, very closely with our critical infrastructure partners. The great majority of this country's critical infrastructure rests in the hands of the private sector. We work very closely with the private sector to ensure the security of our critical infrastructure. The remarkable men and women of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency do a tremendous job.
And on the issue of cybersecurity, I want to address the current threat landscape. When we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about threats that don't just come up from nation states like Iran, but often from a network of proxies and affiliated groups. Secretary Mayorkas, how is the current conflict in Israel giving us additional insight about Iranian-backed cyber threat actors?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the...
Of course. How is the current conflict in Israel giving us additional insight about Iranian-backed cyber threat actors?
I think what we are seeing, Congressman, and I'll defer to my colleagues as well, as the use of cyber as a tool in the repertoire of our adversaries. And we're seeing that play out in the Middle East conflict, just as we have seen it in the context of the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine.
I appreciate that. One more question for you. In your testimony, you mentioned how critical it is that the CFATS program is reauthorized. I'm particularly invested in the CFATS program because there are 4 facilities covered by the program in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. How does the CFATS program help keep our critical infrastructure safe?
Congressman, the CFATS program, the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards, allow us to inspect facilities to ensure adherence with the security and safety precautions that are necessary to protect the surrounding communities. That is one aspect of CFATS. We must achieve the reauthorization of that program.
I agree. I just want to quickly address some of the ways that my colleagues have attacked Secretary Mayorkas here and in other hearings. Mr. Secretary, you and I have had our disagreements on policies, including recently on an ICE detention center in Elizabeth in my district, and I'm looking forward to your department's response to my letter on that. But I have two quick questions for you. During your long career in public service, including 30 years as a law enforcement official and senior positions in the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration, did you take your responsibility to the American public seriously?
I have, and I continue to do so,
When
Congressman.
President Biden asked you to serve as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, did you accept to help keep the American people safe?
I did, Congressman.
Is that what you focus on every single day when you wake up to take this office?
It indeed is.
Thank you so much for your service, sir. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito, the gentleman from the great state of New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, the crisis at the southwest border not only impacts border states such as Texas and Arizona, but now every state is truly a border state. State and local leaders from sanctuary cities such as New York and Chicago are starting to feel the strain effects of the border crisis. Over the last months, we've seen dozens of arrests at the Roosevelt Hotel, which is housing migrants, including crimes against children, assaults, traumatic beatings using no parking signs, and assaults against my fellow members of the NYPD. There was a migrant that came into New York City that in his first 45 days in New York was arrested 6 times on 14 different charges. But there was no charges because the great district attorney, one that my colleague from New York, Mr. Goldman, has supported, the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, declined prosecution. Governor Hochul has said there's no room left at the inn. There is, and I've spoken as recently as 25 minutes ago to commissioners of police on Long Island who said there is zero communication from Homeland Security about the individuals that are coming in to our communities. Less than 2 years into his tenure, Mayor Adams has faced challenges finding housing and feeding millions of migrants that have come from the border. Mayor Adams at one point during a public speech said, and I quote, "The influx of migrants along the southwest border will destroy New York City," end quote. Illinois Governor, another Democrat, recently sent a letter to President Biden calling the influx, quote, "untenable." New York City is facing a potential 15% cut across the board to city agencies over the next 9 months. Why? To deal with migrants because of your failed policies. So my question, and these are yes or no time to answer differently. Do you agree with Mayor Adams when he said that the influx of migrants along the southwest border will destroy New York City, yes or no?
Congressman, let me...
Yes or no, sir?
Congressman, I'm going to answer your question. That we do not underestimate the challenge of the southern border.
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, it's a yes or no question.
I've answered that question, and let me also add...
Okay, do you agree with the Illinois governor who sent a letter to President Biden calling the influx unattainable? Yes or no?
Congressman, we work very closely with the cities to address...
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, it's a yes or no question. Yes or not?
I'm going to answer your question,
Okay. Does it concern you that Mayor Adams' office asked a judge to stop a decades-old right-to-shelter mandate which requires New York to give place to sleep anyone who needs one? Yes or no?
Congressman, I can't speak to
Okay. Does it concern you that the surge of illegal aliens crossing the southwest border has overwhelmed our big cities like New York with approximately 60,000 occupying beds in traditional city shelters and in over 20 emergency sites? Yes or no?
Congressman, I am incredibly proud of the men and women of the Department.
Does it concern you that Mayor Adams stated, and I quote, "We, the city of New York, are getting no support on this national crisis," end quote? Yes or no?
Congressman, we are very proud of the work.
Does it concern you that as of August 2023, New York City was paying almost $10 million per day to provide services for illegal aliens? Yes or no?
Do I have a chance to answer your question?
Sure. If the answer is yes or no, you have had the opportunity to answer every one of my questions. But you refuse to answer the questions whether they're yes or no. These are not trick questions. They're not trick questions. The answers should unequivocally be yes. Every state is a border state. Every city is a border city, especially when it comes to bearing the cost of you and President Biden's failed policies at the border. I agree with my colleagues. You should be impeached. And that is why we are doing the work that this committee is doing, because you have failed your oath. And as someone who has taken oaths, probably the one most important, besides being a member of Congress, as a New York City police detective, I live that oath every single day. And to answer the question that you were asked, do you wake up every morning? You clearly don't. Because from every moment, from the time that you wake up to the time that you go to sleep, your focus should be securing this border. And there has never, ever been such a disaster at our southern border as it is now, and that is because of your failed leadership. It's a dereliction of your duty, and quite frankly, the questions that I answered should have been unequivocally yes. But you sat there and you decided to answer it in another fashion. And that speaks volumes. And that is why this committee will continue working to put the facts together to make sure that we find a new Secretary of Homeland Security, one that holds this country and this nation as most important. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman, the gentleman from New York, for his 5 minutes question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that my colleague from the 4th District of New York, which does not include any part of New York City, has spent time as a NYPD detective and is now an expert on our border policy and the history of it as he leaves this room. Secretary Mayorkas, you were not allowed to answer a number of the questions that my colleague just asked you. I'd like to give you some time to respond if you would like.
Congressman, I would only say this, that we do not minimize the significance of the challenge at the southern border. We also understand the challenge at the southern border and the fact that it is reflective of a challenge that is gripping our entire hemisphere and, in fact, the world. Yesterday, I spent time with my counterparts from the European Union who spoke of the challenges that they are suffering by reason of an historic displacement of people around the world. We work day and night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to advance the security of our southwest border, to advance the security of the northern border, and to achieve our highest and most important mission, the safety and security of the American people.
I appreciate that, and I also appreciate very much that policy disputes are not impeachable offenses. And we can wax poetic and make big political pronouncements about whether you should be impeached or not, but impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors, bribery and treason. A policy dispute and a disagreement about how we are managing the border is not impeachable. But I do want to give you just an opportunity, because I know the administration under your leadership has actually taken numerous measures to address what you rightly point out to be a dramatic increase in the influx of immigrants to this country, in large part because of the collapsing governments in Central and South America, as well as climate disruption. So could you just describe briefly some of the measures that you have taken to address this influx in immigration at our southern border?
Congressman, the foundational point is the following, and it's a point about which everyone agrees, that we are working with a broken immigration system that has been in desperate need of reform for more than 20 years. I believe it's since 1996. Number one, within the confines of that broken immigration system, we are implementing a model that does work, and that is to build safe, lawful, and orderly pathways for individuals to obtain the relief that the law that Congress has passed provides them, and to deliver consequences for those individuals who do not avail themselves of those pathways. That is a model that is proven effective in the context of a broken immigration system, and also in the context of a phenomenon, the phenomenon of migration of displaced people that is incredibly dynamic and changes month to month.
And I appreciate very much your point, which my Republican colleagues do not seem to accept, which is that our immigration system can only be fixed by us. It requires legislation passed by Congress that cannot be managed separately and individually by the executive branch. Director Wray, in my short time left, I want to focus on a testimony you gave a couple weeks ago, noting the tremendous uptick in anti-Semitic hate crimes. I believe you testified that even though Jews make up only 2.4% of the United States population, anti-Semitic hate crimes account for around 60% of all religious-based hate crimes. And you indicated that this comes from across the spectrum, from the left, from the right, foreign terrorist organizations, homegrown violent extremists, domestic violent extremists. Can you expand a little bit on those heightened threats to the Jewish community now 2 weeks later, and how the increase of anti-Semitic hate speech has impacted or affected or increased the threats of violence that the FBI has noticed since October 7th?
Well, so as you said, I have tried to be very clear that one of the things that jumps out at me, and which is why we work so closely at the FBI, both nationally and locally with the Jewish community, is that the Jewish community is uniquely targeted by terrorism and hate really across the spectrum. And not that there should ever be a proportion for hate, but the idea that a group that makes up only 2.4% of the American public should be targeted with something close to 60% of all religiously based hate crime is abhorrent and should be abhorrent to everyone. We have seen over the last few years an increase, not just in hate crimes overall, but an increase, a marked increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes. And that's all with the recognition that hate crimes are, as we all know, chronically underreported. And we have had, just in the past few years, we've thwarted plots to attack synagogues in Colorado, Ohio, Nevada. We've made arrests for threats or attacks against the Jewish community in California to Michigan to New Jersey. We helped rescue the hostages in Colleyville. I could go on. And that's all before October 7th. Since October 7th, as I've testified, we've seen an increase in threats and reported threats, which cover this across the spectrum. But the biggest chunk of those, again, by far, is threats to the Jewish community. And so we are aggressively investigating those threats, but we are also very purposefully and intensely doubling down on our engagement with the Jewish community, which needs our help. And I think it's incumbent on all Americans to stand together on this.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the chairman for indulging over time. I would just add that I do hope that the FBI makes a much more concerted effort to pressure local law enforcement agencies to participate in the collection of data on hate crimes, which is woefully deficient. So even that information that you have only includes about 21% of law enforcement agencies in the country. And I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Lee, the gentlelady from Florida, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, I sponsored the bill to reauthorize the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program, which passed the House 409-1, but unfortunately has stalled in the Senate, and the program has since expired. Secretary Mayorkas, I know you share my concern about the lapse in this program, and I would like to return to your testimony about the potential impact of the lapse in the CFATS program, and specifically, would you speak to the role DHS has in the inspection of chemical facilities and how that changes when the program is allowed to lapse?
Thank you very much for your support, Congresswoman, of the CFATS program. It is vitally necessary to the protection of not only the communities that surround the particular facility, but America as a whole. Without the CFATS authority, we're unable to inspect facilities and ensure their compliance with standards that protect us against very, very dangerous chemicals. And we are fortunate that we have not had an incident that has been a dramatic example of why this authority is so vitally needed.
Do you believe the likelihood or the threat of such an incident potentially occurring is greater when the program is allowed to lapse?
Absolutely, because what we are able to do is ensure that the standards are being enforced and that best security practices are being followed. And when we are not able to inspect and enforce those standards, we see facilities not employing them and creating a significant vulnerability.
Thank you, Secretary Mayorkas. Director Wray, I appreciate the testimony that you've given and the information that you've shared about your internal efforts at the FBI to address FISA reform and to address, taking steps to address abuses to the 702 program and within the FISC, and would like to discuss that issue with you. The House Committee on Judiciary and Intelligence have worked to come up with FISA reform ideas and legislation that would protect Americans' civil liberties while still ensuring that law enforcement has the ability to conduct lawful and necessary surveillance. With the expiration looming at the end of 2023 and the threats that you've described ever increasing to our homeland, I'd like to touch on how the FISA program itself and the 702 program assist in preventing plots to harm Americans and potential threats to the homeland. Would you please elaborate on why 702 is an important part of your work?
So 702 is critical to protecting Americans from foreign terrorist threats. If you think about why 702 was enacted in the first place, even though it's focused on foreign adversaries overseas presenting national security threats, the whole reason we have it is to protect Americans here in the homeland from those threats. And that part is the FBI's part in running U.S. person queries, among other things. If you have a foreign terrorist organization overseas, any one of those ones that I listed off in my opening statement, who decides to task an operative here or to direct an attack here, it is more likely than not that 702 is going to be the thing that would allow us to anticipate or detect that. If we were to deliberately blind ourselves to that information, we are taking a wildly irresponsible risk, in my view. To give you an example, something like 100% of our technically sourced intelligence about Hamas comes from 702. That's just one terrorist organization. So why we would blind ourselves to that when it's not constitutionally required, somebody needs to be able to explain to the families of terrorist victims of the future why something that we were not constitutionally required to do, we just decided to do, it made them and their family members less safe.
In your written testimony, you specifically touch on the concept of a warrant requirement related to U.S. person queries in the 702 database, and your assessment that that would hamper law enforcement's ability and the intelligence community's ability to do their work and utilize the database. Would you explain why it is you believe that a warrant requirement for U.S. persons queries would be a challenge or a hurdle for you all to continue to do that work?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's quite clear under the case law that a warrant is not required constitutionally to run a U.S. person query. This is information that is already lawfully collected, and it's our ability to run queries of the information that's already lawfully collected. The second thing, though, is that the stage in an investigation where 702 is really used is at the front end to quickly figure out, what are we dealing with here? Do we have a threat that we have to pursue? So agility and speed are of the essence. And trying to get a warrant requirement at the front end in that stage is really a non-starter. The delay that it would cause in allowing us to connect the dots, which is what's happening when our people are running U.S. person queries, would basically make the tool largely useless. The other thing that I think people tend to forget when they talk about a warrant requirement is that the vast majority of our U.S. person querying is to identify victims, in particular of cyber attacks. And there's no warrant that anybody would be getting to be able to run a query of a victim term. So we would be essentially putting ourselves in a position where we wouldn't be able to protect American infrastructure from Iranian cyber attacks, Chinese cyber attacks, Russian cyber attacks, North Korean cyber attacks. So again, I think I understand the mindset. We take very seriously our role as stewards of these important authorities. That's why I'm so committed to the reforms that we have made. That's why I'm so gratified by the findings by the FISA court and other outside entities about the effectiveness of those reforms. But please, please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Lady yields. I now recognize Ms. Clark for her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Ranking Member. I sincerely thank our panel of witnesses for both their service and their testimony here today, and I'd like to extend that gratitude to the women and men in the federal enterprise under your leadership. Last Congress, I partnered with my colleagues in the Senate and across the aisle to enact the Cyber Incident Reporting for a Critical Infrastructure Act, which will give the federal government the visibility it needs to identify malicious cyber campaigns early and better understand the tactics of our adversaries to prioritize risk reduction investments. Incident reporting is a critical tool in our ability to defend ourselves, but it is not the only place we need to invest time and resources. Competing incident reporting frameworks will undermine security, not enhance it, because it forces a disproportionate focus on compliance with various reporting regulations over security and incident response. The Cybersecurity Incident Reporting Council has acknowledged as much. Secretary Mayorkas, the Cyber Incident Reporting Council has identified duplicative federal cyber incident reporting requirements. The National Cybersecurity Strategy continues to task DHS with harmonizing the federal cyber incident reporting requirements. How willing are DHS's federal partners, including independent agencies, to do the work of harmonizing incident reporting requirements? And are you concerned that multiple inconsistent reporting requirements could frustrate the security value of incident reporting?
Congresswoman, this is a very important subject in a domain that is only becoming of increasing significance to the security of our critical infrastructure and our country writ large. One, we are receiving excellent cooperation from our federal partners with respect to the Cyber Incident Reporting Council and its effort to harmonize reporting requirements. It is a challenge because there are also independent agencies that have particular mandates, and they perceive sometimes those mandates requiring a different process, a different timeline than other departments and agencies do. We are all driving towards the same outcome of a cyber-secure America, but there are some tensions with respect to particular jurisdictions, and we're working through them and everyone has demonstrated impeccable motive.
Very well. Director Wray and Director Abazaid, I remembered like lemonade, it was stuck in my head. What do you make of the fact that the US-based persons who are primarily responsible for terrorism threats here in our homeland? I'm sorry, let me back up here, let me start, okay. I am struck by an unclassified NCTC product entitled Foreign Terrorists Inspired, Enabled, and Directed Attacks in the United States since 9/11 as of February 2023 that identified 47 attacks and concludes that of the 47, 41 involved U.S. persons. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are paying attention and will recognize that their fixation solely on threats coming over the southwestern border is dangerous. We cannot lose sight of the threats right here at home, and it is urgent that we work to counter radicalization of U.S. persons. So again, my question is, what do you make of the fact that U.S.-based persons are primarily responsible for terrorism threats here in our homeland, and how difficult does this make it for the FBI and CTC to detect and thwart possible attacks? And are you having to shift your counterterrorism approach to accomplish this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It goes right in line with my testimony here today, which is that the heightened threat environment in the United States is being driven by individuals that are inspired to act. I think you've rightly outlined the number of foreign terrorist inspired, enabled, or directed attacks since 9/11 here on U.S. soil, and most of those have been inspired attacks. Some have been enabled, some have been, only 3, I think, have actually been directed by foreign terrorist organizations. So that history, I think, is an important sort of context for the heightened threat environment we're dealing with here today. That said, part of the reason that we've had that level of success is because of the very clear priority we've placed on screening, vetting, watch listing, terrorist identities, known and suspected terrorist databases on the classified side that really support border security efforts writ large.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman. Again, as we move to Thanksgiving next week, I give thanks for you and the work that you do, and to all of those families that sacrifice on behalf of the American people. Happy Thanksgiving to all my colleagues, and I yield back.
Well said, Ms. Clark. Thank you for that. The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell, the gentleman from Texas, for his 5 minutes questions.
Good afternoon. 19 terrorists in September 2001 killed 3,000 of our citizens. And then last month, Hamas fighters invaded Israel. Ms. Abizaid, do we have a number on how many Hamas fighters came into Israel? Do we have a round number on that?
I don't have a number for you.
Mr. Wray, you know?
I don't.
Almost a month passed, although we don't have a good accountability on what those numbers look like.
I'm sure we can get those for you. I don't have them for you today, but it was a sizable number to a shocking degree.
So how many deaths in Israel last month, total civilian?
Well, we've seen the Israeli government revise their casualty estimates down to around 1,200. Again, a shocking number of deaths.
How many hostages remain?
There are over 200. Is my understanding.
Mr. Wray, do you believe that in America or globally there's a war on fentanyl?
Do I believe there's a war on fentanyl?
Yeah.
I think there's a whole of government effort to combat the scourge.
Just the sheer number of deaths that we see daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly. I'm
sorry,
I would just say sheer numbers that we're losing to fentanyl. And as a military man, I would think that loss would calculate a sheer conflict. So my question is, do you consider our challenges against the fentanyl crisis a war? Or is that too bold of a statement?
No, I don't. I mean, look, I think bold language is appropriate when it comes to fentanyl. I will tell you that on the FBI end, when we are making gang arrests, we have seen over and over again violent gang arrests more often than not now include fentanyl seizures. That's all over the country. That's just one metric, but it shows the degree, along with, for example, the case that I mentioned in Boston in my opening statement, just shows it is a routine thing now for our people working with our partners to be making seizures of fentanyl that in one seizure would be enough to wipe out an entire state.
I would add sex trafficking to the war as well, given the sheer numbers of individuals that are being held across the globe. Ms. Abizaid or Mr. Wray, how many known groups or individuals in the United States are we monitoring for terroristic activity that we need to be concerned on? And Mr. Mayorkas, I know Mr. Pfluger asked you these questions with that chart, but I'm concerned, we're concerned that is there a substantial amount, again, 19 for 9/11, let's just say 200 maybe Hamas fighters came into Israel. Those are very small numbers compared to the damages that they inflicted. So are we actively engaged on any terroristic watch list inside the United States that provide an absolute risk or threat right now?
Well, let me try to answer the question this way. We FBI have, through our 56 Joint Terrorism Task Forces, have active investigations that relate to Hamas, that relate to Al-Qaeda.
You said that very eloquently earlier, sir. I hate to cut you off. Okay. You don't have to repeat yourself. My concern is I want to know, can I go home and tell my people in Texas that we are in a safe place? There's no viable risk that we need to be concerned about right now, given just the numbers that have come across the border, Mr. Mayorkas, these numbers you get hit in the face with this every day. So I'm sure you know them well, but in 18, we had 6 known registers, then it goes down to 3, 22, went up to 98. This year it's 172, and already in 24 fiscal year, we're at 13. So again, this is a worldwide threat to the homeland. My concern is, are we missing something? Where is our blind side? Is there one, and are we addressing it? Either one of you.
So as an intelligence professional, we're always concerned about the gaps that we have, about the global terrorism environment. For my part, we're very focused on foreign terrorist organizations overseas, what we can learn about their plans and intentions, and the degree to which they have tried to seed operatives here in the United States.
Are you seeing them seeding those or sowing those threads here in the United States?
We do not have credible or corroborated indications that they are trying to seed operatives into the United States for terrorist purposes through the southwest border or other borders. That doesn't mean we're complacent, and it is a risk that we monitor and we evaluate every day.
Okay. Mr. Mayorkas, you mentioned in your opening statement, and I mimic Ms. Lee's statement about 4470 passed the House. Passed out of the committee through the House. It's sitting in the Senate for CFATs. In your opening statement, you mentioned Shepherd, Texas. Do you know where Shepherd, Texas is?
Not precisely, Congressman.
I was kind of hoping you would say yes, because I'm sure you wrote your opening statement. Well, Shepherd, Texas, that's my district. I didn't intentionally think you were going to start you would throw darts at me after our discussion, and I want to thank you for coming to my office after the first time that we met. You said you would do that, and you did. So thank you very much. But that facility in Shepherd, Texas, a Class A facility, very small. And do you know how the explosion happened?
Not precisely, Congressman. I'm aware of the fact of the explosion and how it underscores the criticality of the CFATS program.
It does, and it's a human error is how that inevitably explosion happened. But I don't know if you're aware of this now, but that facility is not under the CFATS regulation. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention since I thought you were talking directly to me when you said that. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware that that particular facility does not, even though we support CFATS, that one does not live in that space. But thank you. And again, thank you for coming to my office like you said you would do.
Thank you, Congressman.
Gentleman yields, and I think Ms. Titus has asked to defer to Mr. Strong and then come back to her, so we will grant that request. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, is recognized for his 5 minutes testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, I want to follow up on Representative Pfluger's question. In August, CNN reported that a human smuggling ring containing at least one individual with known ties to ISIS was responsible for bringing a number of Uzbek, which is Uzbekistan, migrants to the border who were subsequently released into the country. And I do have that document, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to add that to the record. Unanimous consent to add this. Thank you. After learning of the ISIS connection, the Biden administration has been scrambling to determine the whereabouts of these Uzbek individuals. Secretary Mayorkas, has the Biden administration determined the whereabouts of all of these individuals? Have they all been detained? Have they all been vetted?
Congressman, we vet and screen individuals whom we encounter at the southwest border, number one. Number two, individuals who pose a threat to the safety of the American people, who pose a public safety or national security threat, and whose release would advance that threat are in fact detained. They are in immigration enforcement proceedings, and they will be removed if in fact they don't have a basis to remain in the United States.
Have they been detained?
There are those who have been detained because, in fact, we cannot be assured of the safety of the public. And I would be pleased to provide you with greater details in a different setting.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As you know, the non-intrusive inspection system program is critical for detecting illegal drugs such as fentanyl and other illicit contraband hidden inside cars, trucks, and cargo entering the U.S. Legally through ports of entry. Secretary Mayorkas, you have stated in recent testimony before the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee that DHS has surged resources to our ports of entry as it relates to NII systems. However, DHS own numbers tell us that with the NII system, only approximately 2% of passenger vehicles and 17% of cargo vehicles are even inspected for the detection of fentanyl and other contraband. Do you really consider that a surge of resources?
Oh, Congressman, we have surged not only the deployment of technology, the non-intrusive inspection technology known by its acronym NII, but we have also surged forward operating labs to be able to analyze controlled substances that are interdicted. And if, in fact, we identify them as fentanyl, then we take the appropriate prosecutorial action specific to the attempted importation of this incredibly fatal
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I reclaim the time.
Also,
Thank you. Director Wray, I appreciate your candor when you testified last year that the border represents significant concerns to the FBI. Since then, the number of illegal border crossings, gotaways, and those on the terrorist watch list attempting to cross into the U.S. has continued to balloon. Would it be safe to say that the situation at our border is still of significant concern?
Well, certainly the concerns that I articulated last year remain very much top of mind for us.
Thank you. Director Wray, I know that it is not your border policies that have gotten us here, but I would be remiss not to mention the strain that the open border puts on your workforce and their ability to carry out the FBI's primary mission. But that is not what I want to talk to you about today. In your testimony, you mentioned the threat posed by criminal syndicates and nation states as it relates to cyber. Specifically, you spoke to the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party in this arena. I was glad you briefly mentioned earlier the impact of advanced training in cyber. Can you speak to the capabilities of the FBI Redstone in Huntsville, Alabama, and specifically the role that Huntsville plays in combating the unique and evolving cyber threats posed by our adversaries?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I am incredibly excited about everything that's going on in Huntsville, including, in particular, we view that as where we're going to have be the center of gravity for our advanced training, especially high tech, especially cyber, especially innovation. We've been down there numerous times to check on the expansion, and we're now up to, I think, about 1,900 employees down there. 19 different headquarters divisions have people there, so it's a hub of activity, and especially on the cyber side, I think it's going to be a very important part of the FBI's future.
I'd like to say I appreciate that information. We're very proud of how it has worked there at Redstone. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses, especially Secretary Mayorkas, for being here today. As I'm sure you know, it's exactly 1 year ago today that we sat in this hearing with these exact same witnesses, the exact same issues, the exact same questions, and here we are, and this committee's done very little other than talk about the border. I want to thank you first, Mr. Secretary, for working with me on the Sears decision. You know, this week is the week of the big race in Las Vegas, and we worked at my office with your office very hard to get the security level raised to a level 2, and that's been done, and we appreciate that kind of cooperation. Also, I've introduced a bill to codify that program. It's called the Special Events Program and Support Act. It's bipartisan, and so I hope we can continue to work together on that, because I think that will be a good next step. You know, we listened to the story of the threats and who's threatening us and how they're threatening us and where they are and where they came from. You know, right now we're talking about what's happening in the Middle East and how it has been translated to threats or violence in this country. Before, it was talking about it in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on abortion issue. So it seems like the methods are the same, but the motives changed by just whatever is politically on the agenda. And it must be like playing whack-a-mole, how you deal with the threats. Would you tell us kind of what you have in place to adapt or adjust to what the current news is that's bringing out perhaps a new group of these kind of homegrown terrorists?
Congresswoman, is that a question directed?
Yes,
to
or
me?
Mr. Wray, either one.
I would say that the two leaders seated with me and their colleagues in the intelligence and law enforcement enterprise are the best in the world. And that gives us visibility in terms of the threat landscape and allows us to operationalize the measures to meet that challenge.
I would say that we rely heavily on partnerships, state, local, not just with the federal agencies here, but in particular with state, local law enforcement, with the community, with the private sector, in order to be able to try to anticipate where the threat's going, so that we go to where the threat's going to be and not waiting to always be in a reactive posture. Our goal is to be ahead of the threat, and partnerships are the critical ingredient in that. Again, not just within the federal government, but with all those other very important stakeholders.
I know we have a fusion center in Las Vegas where you have a strong presence as these agencies, but also the private sector. Nobody has more security than gaming does, that eye in the sky, so I think they are valuable partners. Excuse me.
Yeah, I would just add to what my colleague said that, you know, we have a workforce combined across our different agencies that is just full of tenacity. And their job is to not sleep on threats. Their job is to understand, be curious, and evaluate every single report that comes in and take it seriously and understand whether it reflects a real and credible threat and whether it reflects a changing trend in the kind of dynamic that we're facing here in the country and globally. And so we're really proud of that tenacious workforce.
Congresswoman, if I can just add, because Director Wray used a term that is incredibly important, that it's the term of partnership, because he indeed is correct. It's not just across the federal enterprise, but with our state, local, tribal, territorial, campus law enforcement, with the private sector, and also, very importantly, with our international partners. It really does require a community of action.
Thank you. I would ask you, Director Wray, about something you kind of expanded on in this report or your statement today from a year ago, and that's international organized crime, the retail crime that we see, organized retail crime. We're going to see more pictures of that as we go into the holiday season, the smash and grab, the shoplifting that then the money is turned into human trafficking or drugs or guns or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's a priority for you?
Well, we are in a number of states supporting our state and local law enforcement partners who are really the first line of defense on that. But to the extent that there are national connections, national networks, to the extent that the crime that you're describing contributes to some broader organized criminal activity, then we're actively engaged. And in some states, for example, we have dedicated task forces that are focused just on that issue. It is something that is heavily concentrated in a few geographies in particular, but it's starting to become a more national trend.
It's not just big box stores anymore, it's small stores. I was in a drugstore and somebody came in, just raked off the eyelashes into a backpack and walked out with them. Now, eyelashes aren't power tools, but it's a problem at all levels. So appreciate you kind of keep an eye on that. Thank you, I yield back.
The gentlelady having yielded back, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Rakeen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our decaying national security is on full display. We know the southern border is open. I think colleagues across the aisle know the southern border is open. Illegal aliens definitely know the southern border is open. The policies are what is causing millions to come to the border. Under the Trump administration, we saw a 45-year low of illegal aliens coming to the border in 2019. Things have completely reversed. We are seeing the highest numbers in our nation's history. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, leadership matters. And there's not been a federal law change that has provoked this. It's the leadership from the top. Since February of 21, Custom and Border Protection has reported over 6.5 million alien encounters at our southern border. Under this administration, an additional 1.7 million gotaways. That is 8.2 million total since this administration took office, and that is 3 times the population of Oklahoma. That means in 3 years, almost every year, the population of Oklahoma is coming illegally across our southern border. Custom and Border Protection reports they've apprehended 294 known or suspected terrorists between ports of entry under President Biden's time frame. Only 14 suspected terrorists were caught trying to cross the border during the entirety of the 4 years of the Trump administration. There is a passage in the Bible that I find interesting. I think it's appropriate. It's Ecclesiastes 8:11. It says, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. It remains and has been lawlessness to cross that border, southern border, with undermining the rule of law. And lawlessness is contagious. Lawlessness of an open border encourages lawlessness of the fentanyl drug trade. It encourages human smuggling. It encourages illegal aliens to drive without a driver's license once they get here, or go on for those illegal aliens that are here and commit additional crimes because they remain hidden. And under your leadership, Secretary Mayorkas, we're not deporting them to the levels that we were. We all know this. Former Ambassador John Richmond was before this committee yesterday. He said that criminal convictions by the Department of Justice against human trafficking is also down 48% since 2019. It's amazing. I've got a couple of pictures here. It's amazing what leadership can do. I want to hold these up. This is a Custom and Border Patrol agent cutting barbed wire that the Texas Department of Public Safety put in place. This administration, leadership, is bringing this about. I've got another picture here. This is a loader tractor, and it is lifting up barbed wire also put in place by the Texas Department of Public Safety. Those images are pointing to the fact that a secure border is lacking, and the Border Patrol agents, following the leadership, the culture of leadership, are doing what they can to undermine the rule of law. We know that as of last June, an illegal immigrant living in Ohio was charged with plotting to kill former President Bush by smuggling Iraqi citizens across the southern border. He applied for asylum the year prior in March of 2021, an assassination plot against a former president of the United States that has ties to what's happening at the southern border. Director Wray, you testified in your opening statement that protecting the American people from terrorism remains the FBI's #1 priority. You also said this morning to our chairman, and I'm quoting you, greater fidelity regarding who comes into the country makes us safer. Director Wray, I understand you're walking a fine line. I understand that you serve this president, and I know that your position is something that you think about in what you say. There's a statement in our culture that says blood on our hands. And many people, if you're interested in where it comes from, it actually comes from the Torah. And I thought it was interesting, Secretary Mayorkas, you started this morning talking about what's happened in Israel in the last 60 days. And in the Torah, in Ezekiel 33, Israel is faced with an invasion and how they defended themselves from that invasion. And in the Torah, in Ezekiel 33, it says this. It says, if you speak to your people and say, if destruction is about to come on the land, the people of the land take a man among them and make him their watchman. Gentlemen, think about the platform, please, that you've been given by this nation. And they make him their watchman, and he sees the sword of danger, destruction coming on the land, and he blows the trumpet and warns the people. Then he who hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, his blood's on his own head. But if the watchman sees the sword coming, the watchman who's been put in that position by his people sees the sword coming, destruction coming, does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and a sword of destruction comes and takes the person from them, talking about the watchman, his blood will be required from the watchman's hand. The individual, the people in that country will be from the watchman. He will have blood on his hands. Director Wray, are you doing all you can to speak to Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden and crying aloud the destruction that's coming to our nation and potentially come if a terrorism attack hits us within the next years, months? Have you done all you can to know that your conscience is clean on this front?
Congressman, my conscience is clean that I'm doing everything in my power to protect the American people from the threat of terrorism, from the threat of fentanyl, from any number of the other threats that we've talked about here today, and that includes working closely with the rest of my colleagues in government.
Mr. Chair, in my discretion, I'll let Mr. Mayorkas respond.
I'll take just a minute, and I appreciate your exercise of discretion. I believe the congressman said that in 2019 there was a decades-long low in the number of encounters at our southwest border. That's a remarkably stunning misstatement of facts, since in 2019 it was almost 100% increase in the number of encounters over just the year prior. But I won't correct all of the misstatements. The misstatements with respect to the concertina wire and the like, I just want to address one. Because I am accused of all sorts of things in these hearings, and I can take it. What I will not accept, I can take it, I don't. I just return to my work, and I do the work of the Department of Homeland Security, incredibly proud to support the 260,000 men and women of that department. But to say that the Border Patrol agents who risk their lives every single day to protect our country, undermine the rule of law, is beyond the pale. And I just want to make that clear.
Well, I think since you've impugned the member, I need to allow him to respond to that. I didn't understand him. I heard him to be indicting leadership, but Mr. Burkeen, you're recognized for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a result of leadership. It's a result of a culture that says one thing and does something else at the southern border. It's lawlessness. And you take a company, you take a government entity, you take anything, leadership matters. And so this is lawlessness, and somebody has to take responsibility for it. And in regards to 2019, one of the months, you saw one of the lowest numbers in 45 years of recorded illegal immigration in 2019. One of those months, that information, I would stand by that.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Director Wray. Have the border security policy changes made under this administration, sir, made it more difficult for the FBI to keep Americans safe?
Well, I don't know that I could cite it to specific policies. What I would say is that certainly the threats that we are contending with that emanate from the other side of the border, whether it's fentanyl trafficking, whether it's the increase in the number of KSTs that we've seen over the last 5 years, all those are things that make the work that the FBI has on our side of the border to try to get ahead of those threats more challenging.
So you don't acknowledge that the increase in traffic that we're seeing, the increase in individuals on the terror watch list have anything to do with some of the policy changes of this administration?
Well, I didn't say that. I think what I was saying is when it comes to border security and questions of how that's supposed to be done, I defer to DHS on that. What I would say is the threats that we're contending with, which come from the other side of the border, are certainly extremely challenging over the last several years.
Thank you, sir. In your professional opinion, what's causing the increase of encounters of individuals on the terror watch list and the traffic at our southern border?
You know, I'm not sure that I have a professional opinion about immigration. We try to stay in our lane and focus on the issues that we're contending with.
Well, I know you do, actually, sir, I know you're a really smart guy. I know you do have an opinion. If you're not willing to share it in this setting, that's okay. But I know you've studied criminology, you've studied deterrence. I mean, you are the head of the FBI. We all recognize that. But I understand, sir, you're in a tough situation here today. On that note, though, Director Wray, is it fair to say that the now President of the United States, while he was campaigning to become president back in June 27, 2019, said this in multiple statements like it on the campaign trail? He said, "And those who come seeking asylum, we should immediately have the capacity to absorb them, keep them safe until they can be heard." On September 12th, sir, 2019, we're a nation who says if you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come. Did you hear any of those comments by then candidate Joe Biden?
I'm not sure I can quote people's campaign statements.
Do you think that has anything to do with the dangerous situation that we now see at our border and now within the United States of America?
Again, I'm not sure that I'm really the one who can speak to immigration dynamics.
I think you could speak to it, sir. I just don't think you want to. Sir, about how many American citizens have been arrested for entering the Capitol on January 6th? If you can just give me an estimate, that'd be great.
Well, I don't know how many were tied to that specific piece of it. I know that we've had upwards of 700 cases brought related to January 6th in one way or another.
Yeah, it's definitely been hundreds, okay? Sir, I'm interested. Has the pipe bomber who planted bombs at the DNC and the RNC on January 6th, has he been arrested yet?
That is something we're still aggressively investigating.
Okay. So you were able to arrest hundreds of individuals who were allowed into the Capitol, walked around, took selfies, but we can't find the individual who committed the most dangerous crime and attempted to cause multiple mass casualty events at the Capitol, or around the Capitol.
Congressman, we have an entire dedicated team focused specifically on this investigation. We've done thousands of interviews, visited, again, just in the pipe bomb investigation, thousands of interviews, visited thousands of residents and businesses, reviewed millions of pieces of data, something like 39,000 video files. We've assessed like 500 or something tips. We've done extensive public publicity. We've increased the reward money. We've got our lab working on it. We've got our WMD directorate working on it. We've got our Office of Technology division, our cellular analysis team. So the folks that we have working on this investigation are working very aggressively on it. And I, as much as anybody, would like to see it solved. But it is certainly not for lack of effort and lack of priority, I can assure you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, do you find it interesting how many whistleblowers there are right now from your organization coming forward and testifying to Congress about the conduct of the FBI and how they no longer even want to work for the FBI? They're willing to risk everything, including their livelihood, to come and talk to Congress about what they perceive to be a change in the culture at the FBI.
Certainly, I respect the role of whistleblowers in our system. It's an important part of the way our system of government works. When it comes to the culture of the FBI, I'm very proud of our 38,000 people. I think you will be relieved to know that the number of people applying to be special agents from the state of Arizona has gone up over 135% over the last 5 years. And the view that you've just described, I don't think matches what I hear from the 55-plus chiefs and sheriffs and other agency heads in the state of Arizona who've dedicated something like 200 plus of their task force officers to serve on our task forces. In fact, we've got about as many task force officers on our
Real
task
quick,
forces
sir,
as we
do you
agents
find their testimonies to be reliable, or do you think that when you hear what they're saying to Congress, do you think they're pushing false narratives?
I'm not going to be weighing in on the accuracy of individual people who have made allegations against us. We take them all seriously. There have been plenty of inaccuracies lodged by any number of people about the FBI. We're going to stay focused on our work and the people we do the work with and the people we do the work for.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. LaLota, for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important hearing. Secretary Mayorkas, during Mr. Garcia's questioning today, you claimed that 90% of fentanyl is carried through ports of entry. Yet this comes a day after the chief of the Border Patrol, Jason Owens, announced the seizure of over 300 pounds of fentanyl, which was not seized at a port of entry. In fact, the Border Patrol seized a record number of fentanyl between ports of entry last year, about 2,800 pounds. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record Chief Owens' social media post regarding this week's fentanyl seizure. I'll read for you, Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
According to the CDC, over 150 people die every day from overdoses related to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Yesterday, USPB agents in Nogales and Wilcox, Arizona, interdicted 2 smuggling loads consisting of over 304 pounds of fentanyl worth over $1.9 million. The leading cause of death amongst Americans ages 18 through 45 is fentanyl overdoses. This addictive drug is responsible for nearly 70% of the United States' 107,000 plus drug overdose deaths in the past year, and is 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. Mr. Secretary, I think one of the biggest threats to Americans in every corner of this country is fentanyl. Do you agree, Secretary Mayorkas?
I do, Congressman. And I will tell you, if I may, that we are taking it to the traffickers.
We're going to get into that in a second, Mr. Secretary. Last year, nearly 200 people died every day from fentanyl poisoning. That's the equivalent of a commercial airliner crashing every day, nearly 75,000 Americans in just 1 year. And the fact that criminal networks have been able to import and distribute an unconscionable amount of fentanyl under your watch, Mr. Secretary, is beyond negligent. Secretary Mayorkas, you have stated many times in the past, and with great pride, that you are, quote, taking it to the cartels, end quote. With 75,000 Americans dead in just 1 year, and cartels raking in billions of dollars and armed to the teeth with military-like weaponry,
and with enough fentanyl coming across our border to kill nearly every human on the planet, would you classify this as successfully, quote, taking it to the cartels, end quote?
Congressman, we have not overcome the scourge of fentanyl, and let me say this, we are taking it to an unprecedented degree to the traffickers. One death from this extraordinarily toxic and fatal opioid.
Are you pleased with your results, Mr. Secretary?
If I may, is one death.
Mr. Secretary, the question was about you taking it to the cartels. Are you pleased with your performance with respect to taking it to the cartels?
I am incredibly proud of the work that the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security.
I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Reclaiming my time, sir. You've stated in past hearings that you've interdicted more fentanyl than ever before. But the very people who work for you say that you're only interdicting anywhere from between 5 and 10% at our ports of entry. Who's right, Mr. Secretary?
Do you realize, Congressman, that there were over 57,000 deaths, overdose deaths from fentanyl in the year 2020?
I appreciate the question. I'm going to ask you a question, though. Who's right? You or the folks who work for you? They're saying that you're massively understating the fentanyl that's being seized between ports of entry and that gets past our border between ports of entry and what you're saying. Are you right, sir, or are they?
No, you're actually mistaken with respect to your characterization of the statements, Congressman. I'd be very happy to clarify for you if you'd give me the opportunity. The fact that we are interdicting an unprecedented amount of fentanyl does not mean that the scourge of fentanyl is diminished. We are seeing an increase.
I'm going to reclaim my time, Mr. Secretary. With respect to the fentanyl that's coming across our border, not at ports of entry, how much fentanyl is coming across our border between ports of entry?
I'd be very happy to provide you with data with respect to the different means by which fentanyl enters our country. By air, we have an interdiction facility.
I'm familiar with the process, Mr. Secretary, but specifically, with respect to known gotaways, how much are they trafficking into our country?
Congressman, I would be very, very pleased to provide you with whatever data you inquire about. We certainly are providing this committee with a tremendous amount of data with respect to all of the mission sets that we perform.
I wish next time you would come with some more specific information, Mr. Secretary. But, Mr. Chairman, with the remaining time I have, I want to shift gears and talk just for a moment about anti-Semitism on college campuses. New York State, my home state, is home to more than 2.2 million Jewish Americans, the largest population of Jewish Americans in the entire country. And according to the American Jewish Population Project at Brandeis University, over 21% of Jewish Americans live in New York State. Unfortunately, since the terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7th, many Jewish students, some of whom are my constituents, don't feel safe merely going to class due to the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And as we're all well aware, a 21-year-old student at Cornell University, located in Ithaca, New York State, was arrested just 2 weeks ago for threatening to, quote, shoot up, end quote, a Jewish students in a predominantly kosher dining hall on that college campus. Thankfully, the federal law enforcement intercepted threats posted online and arrested him before it was too late. Director Wray, I'll ask you some questions in another setting, sir. Thanks so much for your time.
You can always submit those in writing and ask Director Wray to send them to you. The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Kamick, who has waved on to the committee for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's great to be back at Homeland. Secretary Mayorkas, good to see you once again. Director Wray, good to see you, ma'am. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I'll jump right into it, Director Wray. Recently, I have been apprised of information that is concerning regarding individuals that are encountered at the border who, during the process of interviewing in the field, specifically using an I-213 form, the match for their ID comes back as inconclusive. That information is then subsequently redacted and listed as derogatory. When members of this committee, as well as other committees, have attempted to get access to this information, it has been denied. Why is this information in these field interviews with these individuals who have then subsequently been found to be suspected on the suspected terror watch list, why is that information derogatory, and why has the FBI neglected to share that information with Congress?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with the particular redactions in question, so I'm happy to have my staff follow up with you and figure out why there's a disconnect. Certainly, I know we've provided all sorts of information to this committee in a variety of forms, and I'm happy to see what it is that's missing and why.
Well, and I think you have demonstrated a willingness to work with this committee and others. So could you commit in the next 30 days to providing the committee staff on Homeland Security all of the unredacted field interviews?
Well, what I can commit to you is that I will follow up with my team to find out what the heck is going on, and if there's information that we can provide that we haven't, we will.
Well, no, no information should be redacted, and there can be no good reason. If you can't provide me with a reason why the information is listed as derogatory right now, then you should commit to full transparency to Congress. And that can be in a SCIF, that's fine, in a classified setting, but this committee staff should have full access to the field interviews, especially as it pertains to individuals that have been apprehended or encountered at the southwest border with ties to terrorist groups. Yes or no?
I'm not trying to be obtuse, I promise. Since I'm not familiar with the specific redactions, I would ask to be able to go back with my team and find out why it's redacted, and if there's a reason for it that is valid, we will discuss that with you, and if there's not a reason, we will provide you the information.
Director Wray, within 30 days, if you can provide this committee in writing a rationale as to why that information is redacted, and what classifies it as derogatory, that would be incredibly helpful.
We'd be happy to get back to you within 30 days.
And I'm gonna follow up because I wanna be sensitive to the time here. Can you confirm, I know my colleague, August Pfluger from Texas had followed up with Secretary Mayorkas on the issue of Uzbek nationals and their ties to the confirmed ISIS smuggling ring. Can you confirm that you are currently actively investigating the Uzbek nationals that were connected to this ISIS smuggling ring? Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am. We have very focused on this particular threat stream. We have a number of active ongoing investigations related to it. I will say that we have so far not identified any intelligence that the individuals came to conduct terrorist attacks, but that's not the same thing as suggesting that we don't take it extremely seriously and that we're not working it very aggressively. We have lots and lots of agents working on this.
But they did come through a connected terrorist network.
The network that is in question has some ties to ISIS, which is part of why we were concerned. That's why we're taking it so seriously. So what I want to be clear about is not in any way to have my answers suggest to you that we're not taking this extremely seriously and that we're not working it very aggressively. I'm just also trying to avoid undue alarm about what we found so far. So far is a key set of words there. So far.
Okay, I'm gonna have follow-up questions for the record with you, Director Wray and Secretary Mayorkas. I don't want you to feel left out at all. So I wanna touch really quickly on the Homeland Intelligence Experts Group that raises some really questionable concerns about the department's impartiality and objectivity. So isn't it true that on September 19, 2013, the department announced the establishment of the Homeland Intelligence Expert Group to provide advice and perspectives on intelligence and national security efforts to the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA, and the department's Office of Counterterrorism and their coordinator, yes or no?
We recently announced the group.
Yes,
I'm not sure
perfect. So isn't it true that the composition of this so-called experts group includes former top-level intelligence officers James Clapper, Brennan, and Paul Colby?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so are you aware that Clapper, Brennan, and Colby all signed a now discredited public statement on October 19th, 2020 that incorrectly implied the New York Post reporting about Hunter Biden's laptop and influence peddling that was supposedly the product of Russian disinformation?
Congresswoman, these are distinguished former members of the intelligence.
But this is a simple yes or no. Did they or did they not sign the letter?
I don't know the answer to that question, but
I do. They did. Are you aware that on October 19th, 2020, the statement used by various media organizations and social media businesses to downplay and censor the Post reporting before the 2020 presidential election?
I'm sorry, with the indulgence of additional time, Mr. Chairman, could you ask that question just at a bit of a slower pace?
Are you aware that on October 19th, 2020, the statement was used, the statement that was signed by Brennan, Clapper, and Colby was used by multiple media organizations, social media businesses to downplay and censor the story about the Hunter Biden political influence, right before the 2020 presidential election.
I am not tracking that, Congresswoman.
Wow. For as much time and effort as you are putting into a Homeland Intelligence experts group, that seems shocking that you wouldn't be tracking that. Are you aware that another member of this newly created group, then Associate Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice, Tashina Gauhar, I'm sorry, I'm messing up her name here, was extensively involved in the FBI's probe into baseless allegations against President Trump's campaign colluding with Russia?
Congresswoman, let me share with you what I can tell you with confidence is that the individuals who were selected to the experts group are very distinguished and reputable members, former members of the intelligence community, and we're incredibly proud to avail ourselves of their expertise and judgment.
And have since been discredited.
Time has
Thank you.
expired. I want to now yield to the ranking member for his closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've had quite a lengthy hearing about threats to the homeland. I thank our witnesses for their indulgence and patience, and it's appreciated. A couple of things I wanted to add before I do my closing comments. You know, our asylum laws are the laws of the land. As I said in my opening statement, if you don't like them, you're in the right forum to change them. But you can't criticize people who are following the law just because you don't like it. I guess you can, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. I chaired the January 6th committee. I saw a lot of things that went on in this country is clearly not who we are as Americans. I thank the FBI for doing one heck of a job in trying to identify those individuals who attacked this great institution of ours and let the courts determine innocence or guilt. Mr. Wray, I thank you for that. Apart from that, as I said in the start of the hearing, we face serious threats to the homeland from many fronts. A war in the Middle East that may inspire attacks here in the U.S., foreign and domestic terrorism, and cyber attacks, rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and related violence also. Threats to our democratic institutions, our values, as well as our way of life. Serious threats demand action from serious people, not politically motivated attacks, not inflammatory language that divides us rather than unite us, not grandstanding. What is perhaps most troubling is the way my colleagues have twisted facts. Success in interdicting dangerous drugs is suddenly a failure. Success in removing people who should not be in the country is suddenly an impeachable offense. Mr. Chairman, it's upside down. Democrats remain committed to working with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center to address all these threats. Democrats are also ready to back up that commitment by supporting the personnel and resources necessary to carry out this critical mission. As I said, a lot of us talk tough, but when it comes time to putting the resources behind the talk, many of my colleagues don't do it. But then we criticize the men and women who are tasked with the responsibility of carrying forth the direction of keeping us safe. So I hope after we close the hearing, the President has submitted a supplemental budget that will address a lot of the issues that have been discussed and expressed from a concern standpoint. I look forward to the new Speaker calling it up at some point for us to discuss it. But if we don't provide the resources, if you say you are concerned about the threat environment, Israel, Ukraine, other parts of the world, we have to support it. We have yet to get agreement on making that happen. We have to continue to be the world leader. And in order to do that, we have to take responsible action. So this committee has always historically been bipartisan, one of the more bipartisan committees in Congress. I look forward to trying to get us back to that bipartisanship. We can disagree, but the manner in which we disagree, in my humble opinion, is not who we are as Americans, not who we've demonstrated on this committee since its inception. So that's what the dedicated public servants also, who work to keep us safe, do every day. So again, let me thank the three individuals here, but all the men and women, actually who are positioned all around the world, who keep us safe. Thank you so much. On my side, if resources is what you need to get the job done, I commit to support the resources for the men and women to do the job. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I wanted to thank the witnesses for being here. A lot of work goes into preparing for these, I know, and a lot of work goes into doing the jobs that you do. I also want to thank our staff that helps put on these committee hearings. Again, a lot of work, and I know the members pour themselves into preparing for this, so thank the members as well. Director Wray, I want to thank you today for your honest admission that the risk is increased secondary to this war, and you also said in questioning by me, or from me, that this known got away group is a big, huge question mark, that there are no guarantees, and so thus there's an increased risk from that. You know, the question is, how did we get to those known and unknown gotaways so large, well over 300%? I mean, you can add up the last two presidencies in this just 3 years. It exceeds the last 12 years. Well, as I said earlier, I think policies were working. They were removed. People tested the system. They realized you could get in and just be released. They called home, and millions came. This migration crisis is a self-inflicted crisis, one we created by the change of our policies, and it's put Americans at increased risk, as you've acknowledged. And I think I used in my opening statement the analogy of the college bar that stops carding. That bar will be overwhelmed. I think we all get that. And that's what's happened at our southern border. With mass waves of cartels, with this mass wave of people, the cartels have seized the opportunity to overwhelm Customs and Border Patrol and bypass them and get the fentanyl into the United States. How else could we explain the fact that fentanyl was $95 a hit on the street when this Secretary Mayorkas came into office, and it's now $25, $26 a hit in Tennessee? It's simple supply-demand. These catch and release policies that Mr. Mayorkas, you know, I think has implemented is the cause of the problem. And, you know, you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't, with the way these catch and release policies are working now, and I mean, that's really what happens. You look at the CBP1 app, they're only getting rid of, I think 98% of the people who do that get to come into the country. So if you get to come into the country, why wouldn't you just turn yourself into Customs and Border Patrol? Why would somebody even go around Customs and Border Patrol now? Because you're going to come in, get parole, and get into the country. Well, it's because they don't want to be caught. And that scares us even more, considering that it's 2 million people. I also want to thank you, Mr. Wray. You admitted that your department is looking for people right now on the known terrorist watch list. I think your question you answered to Mr. Pfluger. And Mr. Mayorkas kind of didn't really answer the question on whether or not if they identified somebody, 100% of the time they kept them. There was some discussion about a system that was implemented to determine if the person was a risk. We know, because we talked to the Customs and Border Patrol agents, that there is no policy that if they're caught on a terrorist watch list, that they're immediately detained in 100% of the cases. So These policies not to do that, which make no sense to us, have put Americans at risk. And interestingly enough, your agents, who are now having to find these individuals somewhere in our country. Those decisions, those policies not only put the American citizens at risk, they put your agents at risk because they're out there now having to find these individuals. The truth is, the current policy in the Department of Homeland Security does not require immediate detention of these people, and that is wrong. I asked Director Wray if the policies of his colleagues are making it worse for the FBI. That was one of my questions. And you kind of, I get it, professionalism, you walked around that question. But I think it's clear to every American that these policies at our southern border that are willful decisions, those changed policies, have increased the risk of not only the Americans in this country, but also the law enforcement all over this country, to include the FBI. Now, I want to take issue with several of the comments that my colleagues on the minority side have said, some of their accusations today. The ranking member said that Republicans were AWOL. Now, I'm a military guy. That term means something to me. AWOL is an acronym that stands for absent without leave, meaning you don't show up to your place of duty. In my recollection, in all of our committee hearings, the only time someone didn't show up to a hearing was when the Democrats refused to show up at a border hearing. When we had a hearing on the border, all the Republicans were there, not a single Democrat showed up. So as far as I'm concerned, there's never been a time when Republicans have been AWOL, but there certainly was a time when the Democrats were AWOL. The ranking member also said that a lot of the discussion we've had is a difference in policies and things like that. I have to tell you, I agree on some of that. But it's pretty clear that Americans are at risk by decisions that have been made, and there's nothing wrong with us investigating that and pointing it out to the American people and trying to find the cause, and if those decisions have put Americans at risk, holding people accountable. Today, the ranking member, very interestingly, didn't mention Hamas in his opening statement, didn't mention Hezbollah, he didn't mention the cartels, he didn't mention the CCP. The only thing he seemed to want to talk about was the MAGA Republicans and President Trump. I find that interesting, and I'd like to point that out for the record, that in our World Threats hearing, the ranking member didn't talk about any of that. The ranking member suggested that we have a member in our party that wants to defund the FBI. We're not defunding the FBI. But I'll tell you, some of their members want to defund ICE. Have said it many times on the record, more than just one. We had one member of our side that said to defund many of them have wanted to defund ICE. And they've talked about defunding law enforcement all across this country for years. So I was a little offended by the fact that he brought that up, but I wanted to set the record straight on that one. The ranking member also suggested that we are criticizing the men and women of your departments. And I would never do that. I worked for a lot of great military leaders in the day, my time in the Army, and but occasionally we had a guy that, a leader that was not effective. And I'd never be critical of that unit's soldiers, always the leader. Our criticism's not the men and women of DHS, Mr. Secretary. Our criticisms are your policies that you've implemented that changed everything when you came into office and changed the flood of migration and changed the fentanyl flow into this country. And tragically now with a war in the Middle East and heightened risk to the United States because we're supporting their other great enemy, Israel, at much greater risk. I also want to correct this notion because it keeps coming up that 90% of the fentanyl is being caught. Well, that's not true. 90% of what comes across the border that is caught at the crossing sites. That's an accurate statement. But to say that you're catching 90% of the fentanyl, you don't know the denominator, you can't figure the percentage. I wish people would be intellectually accurate when they make statements, but they just seem to cling to things that aren't true. There's also this accusation that just because people want border security that we're somehow racist. We heard that again today. And you would think that that would just get tired and be thrown out. The people coming across the southern border, when I was there was a huge group of Russians. They're whiter than I am. This notion that you're somehow racist because you want border security it's really insane. I can assure you this, the people who are all over this nation right now yelling from the river to the sea, the destruction of Israel, I'll eat that Red Bull can if there's a Republican in that group. I also want to thank you, Ms. Abizaid. You brought up the homegrown and the lone wolves and all this stuff, and you gave some really compelling testimony. I'm from Tennessee, and what happened in Chattanooga several years ago at that recruiting station is just an example of what you're talking about. Keep saying that over and over again. America needs to know about this. They are actively trying to flip people in our country and to convince them to hurt Americans. And that incident in Chattanooga, we in Tennessee will never forget it. And I thank you for bringing that point home. Now, Mr. Mayorkas has said that we need to add dollars. Well, the truth of the matter is there was no budget change between the last administration and this administration, but you can look at the graph. It's like this and then like this. It ain't about dollars, although we're not against. If you look in H.R. 2, we put more dollars into that. Technology, pay for Border Patrol people, despite what some people have said. You also mentioned, Mr. Mayorkas, immigration laws. And yes, they're broken. They need to get fixed. But the truth of the matter is that the Immigration and Nationality Act's being subverted right now. You're not even, courts have ordered you to do it a different way than you're doing it. So I'm not even sure if we did change the immigration laws, you'd even abide by them. The ranking member mentioned that the asylum laws, we need to change that. But we're not living according to the definition of the asylum laws now and detaining people. We're actually sending them to hotels and sending them away while ICE detention beds sit empty, despite what the law says. More resources? No, this is a policy issue. The policies were changed by the Secretary, and the results are people came, some on the terrorist watch list, being chased by the FBI, loose in our country, thousands dead to fentanyl, millions disrupted by the cartel crime, thousands of children lost in the system, thousands of people trafficked, and billions of taxpayer dollars. The New York mayor, who happens to be a Democrat, says it's going to cost his city $12 billion. Right out of the taxpayer dollar, not at their choice. They didn't vote on this. You just moved the policies out of the way. Here, let me write the check, because that's what Mr. Mayorkas wants us to do. And now, as I said, with the conflict in Israel, we are faced with an open border coupled with a heightened threat as we give assistance to as I said, the only other country or group of people that the terrorists hate more than us, Israel. The abysmal failure to secure our southern border has put every American at risk. Even a baby crawling around on the floor of a VRBO who encounters fentanyl left by the previous renter, dead. To crime, to human trafficking, to billions of money going to some of the worst human beings on the planet, cartels, and now, of course, international terrorists. I want to, before I finish my comments, I want to say a few things because you guys have raised some really good points, and I want to just give you some assurances. CFATS, the House passed it. We're pushing the Senate. We have a CFATS working group to try to get it in a posture where the Senate will actually approve it, but that side of the building is controlled by another party. We passed it over here. We're waiting on them. No, we're actually trying to get it in a posture that they'll actually support. UAS, we're working very diligently to get that done. You're right, Director. FISA, there's a special committee that is working on this. I promise you that will get done. The CWMD, of course, was on the CR that just passed. So it's done. It's over on the Senate side waiting. Those are very valiant, are very, I agree with you. Those things need to be taken care of. We're working on it. Mr. Wray, thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Abbott, thank you. Mr. Mayorkas, thank you. I know you rearranged your schedule to stay a little later, and I get that, and I deeply appreciate it. And it's clear that you believe you're doing a great job, and I'm not hiding it. We're looking into all this because we on our side think that you're not. And we're in our last phase of a 5-phase process that you're following in the press, just like the rest of my constituents and people across the country. We're going to finish that up, I think, sometime around December. And I'd love to know today if you'd commit to come back. We'll finish that thing out, I think maybe in December. I mean, does that sound reasonable to you? Will you be able to come back for that?
I will honor the request of this committee.
Thank you. Again, I want to reiterate my point about the people of your departments. It's hard work protecting this country, protecting the citizens of this country, and I know the men and women who do that professionally as a career deserve the utmost of our respect, and every one of them has it from us. Our frustrations are not with them. It's not. It's with leadership that we think has made bad decisions. And with that, I'm concluding my closing remarks. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'd ask that the witnesses respond to those in writing if you get any. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days for those written statements. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.